Welcome to Philosophy15. I'm Robert Talisse.
I'm Scott Aikin.
Scott and I are the authors of several things, including Why We Argue and How We Should, and Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy. This is a video series of short, that is 15-minute conversations, unscripted, about whatever happens to be on our minds. Today, for this episode, Scott has been thinking for a long time about whether argument is intrinsically adversarial. Is it?
Is it? So here's the basic thought behind the adversariality of argument thesis. Whenever you argue, you've got a disagreement, you've got a question, so kind of a challenge being posed that needs to be answered. So someone's either right or not, misguided, or not quite got the correct viewpoint, and so argument is deployed to be able to resolve that situation. So you might say the felicity conditions for arguing is that someone's got a question, that there's an issue between two folks, and argument is the means of resolving that in a fair way that's able to appeal to the reasons and the evidence that the other side is able to access. And so it's not adversarial in the hateful way, but there are opposed views, and argument is a way that's supposed to be able to mitigate those two. So sometimes it's often said that I'm right, or I've got a view, and you've got critical challenges to the view, and so as a consequence, argument is something that's exchanged between the two arguers, is a way of being able to mitigate the cognitive distance between the two of them, and so that's the sort of sometimes called the pragmatic case for the adversariality thesis, and so there's just seeing argument as a phenomenon that sort of just happens between people who care for the truth of the views that they've got and are troubled by the disagreements. Argument's going to have a kind of pragmatic background of adversariality to it. So that's the sort of first prima facie case for it. But then,
can I just ask?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is this an issue because there are people who think that if argumentation is intrinsically adversarial, there's something unduly or inappropriately aggressive or unjust or subordinating or marginalizing about it?
That's the problem.
Okay, so yeah, the worry is that if argument, or when argument is adversarial, it's objectionable on moral grounds. It involves some kind of mistreatment of one's interlocutor, and so if argument is intrinsically adversarial, then it looks like argumentation itself is a kind of is a bad activity.
Is a bad activity.
Wrong.
And so there are kind of two ways to go with this question. One is you might say the anti-adversarialists, those who say that argument's not intrinsically adversarial. You say, okay, if the premise is adversariality has got bad political or moral consequences, we want to mitigate that. One argument is, well, we need to reconceive argument so that it's not adversarial. Another path that's been promoted has just been, no, that just means that argument is a bad thing, right? Argument's got a kind of an untoward political and in some ways a kind of disproportion of power, that in conditions where power is disproportionately distributed, there's cases where argument is something that actually is distorting. So those
Isn't that a self-defeat problem, though, right there?
Well, I think that right. You say something like, "How do we get to that view?" And
you just laid out with it to me like an argument,
right?
So.
Yeah, that was very adversarial towards my view. So I think that the sort of try to think of non-argumentative strategies is also going to be something that looks like, well, it looks like the crucial thing about argument is that you're appealing to reason, and so the question here is what the alternative rational appeals to mitigating disagreement are going to be. One case for the non-adversarial argument, or at the very least a case against the pragmatic argument, is that it looks like you can have arguments with yourself, or you can give yourself an argument, and it looks like I'm not an adversary to myself, or you say, like, I've got a question, and I kind of reason something through, and I give myself an argument. And so it looks like there are ways to sort of say, like, look, it looks like the sort of the premise behind the pragmatic case for intrinsic adversariality has got a case where you say, we take something that looks like it's a paradigm case of argument, where you've got people who disagree, but the paradigm case doesn't exhaust all cases. And so taking a look at argument as primarily adversarial doesn't mean that it's doesn't have to mean that it's intrinsically so, at least in that pragmatic case. But a lot of the other models are ones where we say, look, we need to reconceive argument as a kind of a cooperative practice. Folks have proposed bridge building as a sort of a way of thinking about how argument goes, or barn raising, a kind of a collaborative exercise where what we're doing is we're communicating information with each other. And one way to even kind of think about it is that the non-adversarial conceptions of argument are then even supposed to say, look, given the epistemic goods that are at stake in argument, if in an adversarial circumstance, if you lose an argument, you lose, right? But given the epistemic stakes of argument, if you lose an argument, you win, because you're no longer in possession of a false view. Maybe you're in possession of a less false view, or sort of a better supported view given the evidence that's available. And so there are senses that these non-adversarial models and cases against the adversariality of argument case are really appealing. And again, not just because of the sort of the epistemic stakes, but also because of the social stakes. It looks like adversariality is something that silences folks from marginal groups. It makes it so that those with a disproportionate amount of power can talk over and be able to make it so that they don't even have to answer certain kinds of questions. So the adversariality of argument has got certain kinds of political risks that go along with it too. So that's where the kind of the debate seems to be standing at this stage with the adversariality case. I've defended a kind of a new form of intrinsicism that doesn't depend on the pragmatic case, and it kind of works like this, which is whenever we're arguing, what we're doing is we're trying to sort how the evidence before us, either shared evidence or even in cases where I argue with myself, I'm trying to sort how the evidence supports one view as opposed to a sort of a set of other contrasting views or other contrary views that are sort of within my frame. And so I don't have to have another person. There's not another human being or speaker that I have to be adversarial towards whenever I'm arguing for a view. What I'm really adversarial toward is this view as opposed to this view. So you might call it the contrastive case for intrinsic adversariality of argument. What I've got is a kind of a range of options, and whenever it looks like I think that the evidence supports this option, I need to show that it doesn't just support this option, it supports this option and as opposed to the other ones. So the pragmatic case takes that, you might say, the fact that I say P, you say Q, they don't fit together, and I need to give our evidence for P that puts it above Q. That pragmatic background is one that is, you don't need another speaker to be able to do that. You just need a range of options for you to be able to sort of do the arguing. The reasons in these sorts of cases come in terms of the fact that the evidence supports this, and this is the better hypothesis than these. So the better comparative terms there are ones that, again, have kind of got that adversarial background to it. But in this regard, you might call it dialectical or logical adversariality instead of the effective adversariality and ones that have got these other kinds of consequences. So I think that with that we can distinguish between the functions of reason that have kind of got this. Whenever I need to think something through, I need to sort of think of the pros and the cons. That's the logical adversariality versus the I'm right, you are wrong. And I've got a kind of an aggressive attitude towards somebody else. That you can distinguish those two. There's the logical adversariality, the pro-con, versus the I'm right, you're wrong. That's, you might call, the effective adversariality. So I think we can keep those two distinct and keep the adversariality of argument thesis.
And is it part of the sort of contrastive conception of the aims of argument, or the contrastive model of what argument is about? Are we now thinking that argumentation is not the attempt to prevail in a dialectical exchange, although it's in part that.
Yep.
It is to prevail in a dialectical exchange after, in light of the exchange, one has enriched one's command the evidence and reasons that are in play, right?
So I think that, and this, by the way, is one of the reasons why I think that there's a real insight behind some of the non-adversarial models, especially the cooperative one, which is that it's effectively trying to live up to a total available evidence requirement here, which is that we are trying to have a command of the issue. And there's other kinds of goods that arise from this. Even if we don't resolve our disagreement, there are other goods that arise from our exchange that can be recognized, again, as, well, in some ways the argument failed, but the argument actually provided other kinds of goods that weren't necessarily resolution, which was, I'm able to understand, like understanding seems to come from it, or our favorite term, cognitive command, seems to come from, it's like, look, I've actually got an enriched notion of actually what my own view is, right? That's a kind of a Millian thought, which, like, I actually understand my own view better after having understood the case against it. So I think that again, the insights from the non-adversarialists in terms of these cooperative background conditions for argument actually are ones that allow us to be able to see what other kinds of epistemic and cognitive goods are available even from an adversarial perspective.
Right, so, but isn't it possible that you can only, or maybe the best way to maximize those other goods is in adversarial context?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not an accident that whenever we set up textbooks on issues, that we set them up as debates.
Right.
Right, we see, and they even seem to be much more interesting whenever it's like, okay, here's the pro side, here's the con side, and then we go to the next debate. We're like, oh no, now the pro side gets to respond to the con side, and the con side gets to respond. Like that's whenever the debates get interesting, and so in some ways you see the way that these textbook works. It's like we seem to understand the even if you think that one side won the debate, you understand the issue and you understand the view better after having seen it in this sort of back and forth dialectical exchange. And so it puts things in sort of higher contrast, we might say.
Right. So then is your view then that yes, argument is intrinsically adversarial?
Yes.
No, that is not a problem because adversariality is not exactly what the anti-adversarialists say it is.
Right. And notice, by the way, that what's necessary then for someone who's committed to a version of my view is then to be able to articulate ways that the negative consequences of adversariality, what might be called effective adversariality, that the things that cause you to react, right? And cause you to behave in ways that are objectionable, ways that those can be mitigated. And so, on the one hand, argumentative exchanges, because they're iterative, they can escalate, things can get wider and more, not just more demanding, but also more becomes at stake. It's really easy for argumentative exchanges to escalate and become unpleasant. And so it's really important for us to distinguish between the adversariality, the logical adversariality, and all the ways that we get affected by that. And there are certain kinds of virtues and certain kinds of skills and certain means of presentation that are necessary for you to be able to for us to be able to prevent those escalations. And recognizing the ways that these things can escalate and have those bad consequences has got to be part of the responsible arguing. Recognizing that argument has got this tendency. It's still something that we need to be able to do, and that adversariality is something intrinsic to it, but it's also gonna have some dangers to it, and we need to be open-eyed about those.
Right. But do we still have a problem then of the ways in which norms of domination and exclusion and marginalization are sort of not exorable from the model?
They can be. So there's nothing about the model that guarantees that they're that they're made impossible, right? So we might say something like the benefit of the non-adversarial model is that they guarantee that stuff never happens, right? I think that's highly unlikely. I think that's highly unlikely.
You mean that's what the non-adversarial says?
That's what the non-adversarial says. I think that's just highly unlikely that won't happen. That you might say, I've known plenty of people who've sort of done done passive aggressive things and displayed their power not by arguing but by other means, by, you might say, overt sort of coercive friendliness. But the point here is just that given the demands of the logical adversariality, exclusion from conversation is actually going to have bad consequences. So given the epistemic stakes and the goods that you can achieve from logical adversariality, that then yields requirements for inclusion on the other side. It's a kind of a Millian argument, and one that's very familiar to our watchers.
Philosophy 15, folks.
Next time.
See you next time.